Hello, thank you everybody for joining our first wildlife webinar of California Envirothon 2022. I am Lauren Sullivan. I volunteer with the Envirothon team, and I'm the area biologist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Salinas, California. And we have a great speaker with us today. He is a non-governmental organization partner for natural resources in the beautiful Central Coast area that I work in. We have Mike Stake from Ventana Wildlife Society. He is a biologist with them, a senior biologist, and their organization helps manage the California Condor population in Central California. So Mike is gonna do a presentation. There's gonna be some time where we would like some feedback from you guys. So we ask that you please participate either through the chat box or raising your hand and asking questions. And we'll also have time for questions at the end. So thank you all very much for taking time out of your Saturday to be with us. Mike, would you like to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Lauren. I'm going to share my screen and maybe give me a thumbs up if you see a beautiful condor head on your screen. Are we in good shape so far? All right, thank you. Yeah, and I do invite questions. I just want to echo what Lauren said, and Lauren will help me help direct those questions to me. They can be in the chat or really at any time. I'm certainly willing to pause and answer questions, because sometimes the best time to answer a question is when they come to mind. But I'll be talking a little bit about the basic condor story and their biology, some of the problems that they've faced, what the outlook for the population is, and how we're going about attacking this lead threat. And right now, lead remains the greatest threat to the full recovery of California condors. I am a biologist, but several years ago, a project landed on my desk. Mike, would you work with hunters and ranchers to reduce lead poisoning for California condors? And gradually since then, more of my time has been devoted to ammunition outreach. So as a biologist, I've had to take a little bit of a detour and become an ammunition expert. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that happens as we go on. This is an overview of the condor population. Are you in Condor Range? Well, if you are somewhere in that yellow shaded area, then perhaps you are. If you are in sort of rugged mountainous terrain, that is good condor habitat. So the Coast Range is certainly excellent. The Gavilan Range inland towards Pinnacles National Park. And I put the number 90 there as an approximation of the Central California population. It's actually 91 as I speak today. That population is still disjunct from the Southern California population, even though that yellow looks continuous. The birds haven't quite come together in South to Southern California. We have different managing agencies for these populations in Central California. My organization, Ventana Wildlife Society, co-manages the population with Pinnacles National Park. And then to the south, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages that population. San Diego Zoo down in Baja, California, and another organization called the Peregrine Fund. They manage a population in Arizona that has spread into neighboring states. A little bit about condors. What do condors eat? Well, they eat whales. Among other things, they eat dead things. And so those dead things can range in size from a whale all the way down to, say, a ground squirrel. And ground squirrels can be an important part of this topic that we're tackling today. And so 1602 was the first observation of a condor that was actually recorded, and this observation involved them feeding on a whale. Moving ahead to centuries later, Lewis and Clark described the vulture of the Columbia, and so they actually were able to measure the bird and find that it had a 9.5-foot wingspan. That's much bigger than the turkey vultures you normally see. Those get up to about 6 feet in wingspan. Eagles are maybe 7.5 feet wingspan. So the condors are the largest North American land bird in terms of wingspan. Lewis and Clark provided a nice drawing for their notebook. Good scientists always keep a notebook, and so they were including some measurements and a little diagram here. And they mentioned that it was a very handsome bird, but they added at a little distance just to be clear. And I guess you can be the judge of condor beauty. When I lead tours, my guests often say, wow, these birds are really, really amazing. Better from a distance though, but even close up, they have their charms as well. And moving a little bit forward, in 1835, another explorer, John Townsend, encountered California condors. He expressed his inexpressible joy at seeing the condor soaring. Down like an arrow he plunged. At that moment, I fired. And if you're like me, you may have trouble understanding or reconciling that inexpressible joy with shooting the bird, but that's sort of what happened in 1835. If you wanted to see specimens closer up, well, you generally had to shoot them. And so that's something that occurred a lot with California condors. And the population suffered as a result. There may be a couple of us that remember the 1980s. This is when I was becoming interested in birds. Back in 1982, the condor population reached its lowest point at 22 birds globally. That's when they made the decision to bring them all in. And so they scooped up all the remaining birds, and by 1987, there were 0 wild condors and 27 captive condors. They began a captive breeding program with the hopes of having enough birds to bring back into the wild. And that's where our story will pick up. But some reasons for the decline involved the shooting that I mentioned. As early as the 1980s, with radio telemetry, biologists were able to discover that lead poisoning was having an effect on condors. And I believe we have a question from Alec. Alec, would you like to join us?
Yes. Would you mind giving a definition of captivity? Like, what does it mean to have a captive condor?
Yeah, I think a general definition would be a bird that's not free flying, that's contained in some sort of a cage or a flight pen. There are condors that are captive today as part of the captive breeding program. They're kept in cages, and sometimes the wild birds have periods of captivity where they may be suffering from lead poisoning and they need treatment, and so they're kept in cages. And so that's just to differentiate a free-flying wild bird from a bird that is either temporarily or permanently held captive. Let's go with one more, Lauren. Can you identify someone?
Yeah, Andrea has a question also.
Okay, Andrea.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
I had another question also regarding captivity, and you said that once the population reached a certain point again, you were going to release them back into the wild. Can you elaborate on how that process works from wild to captivity to wild again?
Right. That's it. The answer to that question, I think, changes depending on the situation. And so I'll go back to 1987. If you can imagine, there's no condors in the wild and they're breeding in captivity, there's a lot of pressure to bring them back into the wild, because without any wild birds, you're worried about condors forgetting that tribal knowledge, forgetting how to be condors in the wild. And so the longer that you have them out of the wild, the greater risk of birds not reclaiming their natural habitat and natural behaviors again. And so there was a lot of impetus to really speed up the releases in the early 1990s. Now birds are held in captivity for various reasons, and one reason might be to treat them for lead poisoning, and that bird might be held in captivity for quite some time until it recovers and then is deemed releasable again. Other birds are raised in captivity with the plan to release them into the wild. And so those birds need a conditioning period that's a cage in the wild where they're going to be released. So they're actually able to experience the environment that they're in before they have to face the pressures of being out in the wild. So they may be held for several months before they're actually released in a cage at their release site. So thank you for those two questions. I'm going to move ahead a little bit and talk about some of the pressures that condors have faced in addition to the troubles that the environment has posed to them. Their biology gives them several disadvantages. One is that it takes them a long time to reach breeding age. It takes them at least 6 years of age. And so you can see how they change appearance from when they first come out of the egg. They have very dark heads, and then as they grow and they gradually turn pinkish in the neck and head, and then at 6 years old, they're fully breeding age. That's very late for a bird. And in addition to that, they only lay one egg. It's about the size of an avocado. It takes 2 months for the egg to hatch. And if we do some math, after it hatches, it takes 6 to 8 months for the chick to leave the nest. And then once it does, it's on the parent for many months after that. So the parent, if everything goes well, the parents are not able to breed the following season because they're still taking care of their chick. And so they'll lay that egg every other year. So reproduction is very slow. And so if we can model this on a timeline, these are actually turkey vultures. And I want to compare condors to turkey vultures for a second. This is a 3-year timeline. Each of those little hash marks is a month. And so at the far left, January, the next hash mark, February, turkey vultures will lay 2 eggs. Those eggs will hatch. And then those 2 birds are ready to leave the nest mid-year. And then the parents are ready to do it all over again in year 2 and in year 3 and so forth. Comparing that to condors, condors actually start laying eggs earlier than turkey vultures. In fact, right now, January 29, is it? This is the start of condor breeding season, even though we're right here in the middle of winter. So they lay that 1 egg, that chick hatches sometime during the spring. And then late in the year, the condor leaves the nest. And it's so late that there's no breeding in year 2. Hopefully there's breeding in year 3, but reproduction compared to turkey vultures, and really compared to any other bird, is extremely slow. And so that's a disadvantage for condors. And so those disadvantages in red here: slow maturation, few eggs, That's not a problem because they're designed to live a long time. They can live 60 years. And so that long lifespan offsets and balances the slow reproduction. And so you have a stable population. But what happens if you have excessive adult mortality, like lead poisoning, and you lose a lot of adult birds before they can reach their 60 years? That lead is weighing down on the population. Too many disadvantages. You have natural and unnatural imbalance, and the population declines. And that's what we've seen with condors for the last 100 years at least. And so that's why humans, as the original cause of their decline, have to intercede on their behalf to recover the population. And that's where we stand now, releasing birds. And we've talked about it. In 1992, the captive breeding program had been doing great. Birds were ready to be released. And we broke one of the rules in species recovery. That rule is, if you're going to put birds back into the environment they came from, clean up the environment before you do that. Well, there just wasn't time to do this. Condors were so critically endangered, down to just in the 20s for the population. They had to get birds out back into the wild quickly. And so that's been a problem because the lead poisoning issue still has not gone away. Yet because of releases, we have a more robust population, 90 birds in Central California and over 300 total in the wild now. Here we see Joe Burnett. He is doing a report on a fallen condor, and this is really a scene that's all too common now. And in fact, we've seen a surge in the last couple of years in lead poisoning. Ventana Wildlife started releasing birds in 1997. We discovered our first lead death in 2003. And as the population has grown since then, we've had periodic surges, one in 2013 and another here in the last 2 years. Now, the population has grown through releases and through reproduction in the wild. So we expect a few more deaths nowadays, but still the level of lead poisoning is too great to sustain the population. We need to get back to where we were on the left side of this graph.
Mike, would you, I don't know if you're planning to do why lead is so bad. I mean, we know it's bad for people and it's bad for birds, but what exactly is it? What's happening that's causing these deaths and causing problems with lead?
Yeah, it's a good question. Lead is a neurotoxin, and it's just a poison that once it gets in the bloodstream, the birds are not able to complete their normal processes of digestion, and they're not able to perform certain neurological processes. So it really becomes a very slow, painful death. Lead is a toxin that affects not just condors, but other wildlife and even humans. It's a human concern, and one that has prompted the gradual moving away from lead in paint, gasoline, and now it's a movement for ammunition, which is typically made of lead. And I think to solve this problem, we have to ask the question, how are condors getting lead? And it's really through their scavenging. They are ingesting little fragments of spent ammunition. When a lead bullet hits an animal or hits any target, it fragments into numerous fingernail clipping sized fragments. It just sort of shatters and leaves a trail. And those lead fragments are easily ingested by wildlife. But it's not just a hunting issue. And that's why I put this illustration on the screen. It can be a ranching issue as well, because ranchers often shoot ground squirrels on their property to control the population of what they perceive as pests. And so those carcasses are being collected by the shooter, and they're available for scavengers like condors. And to add to the problem, the non-lead ammunition that's used for the smaller animals, the smaller calibers, is very difficult to find in non-lead. And so we think that ground squirrel foraging by condors really plays into this lead poisoning problem. And so I want to at least qualify this by saying that ranching and hunting is good for condors. We're not against those ideals. Ranchers provide habitat for wildlife. They provide food, water resources for condors. So ranching is good. We see hunters and ranchers as a solution for wildlife conservation. That solution requires non-lead ammunition. So let me throw it out to you to think about. Now that we know the problem, now that we know that lead is such an issue for condors and other wildlife, what can I do? What can my organization do? What can any organization do to help reduce the exposure of condors and wildlife to lead? Where do we start with this problem? And I invite any of your questions and comments, either in the chat or raise your hand, to help us guide through this problem. I can get started, but if you have any thoughts at any time during this process, just let me know, and we can discuss this together. But I think one place to start might be, what is the law? What does the law require us to do regarding lead? And so I'll bore you for just a moment by putting up the legalese. The law is pretty black and white, at least in California. It makes certain requirements about lead versus non-lead ammunition. Ever since 2008, non-lead ammunition has been required for shooting wildlife in the Condor Range in California. And more recently, that restriction has been extended to cover the entire state. So now it's very simple. If you're shooting any species of wildlife with any firearm, you have to use non-lead ammunition. Now, it's still legal to buy and sell lead ammunition in your store because it's legal to use lead ammunition at target ranges. The rationale here is that at target ranges, wildlife is presumably not affected. They're not ingesting these bullets. And so lead is still out there, but there is a requirement for shooting non-lead ammunition when you're targeting wildlife. So that should solve the problem, right? Well, that was several years ago. And as I mentioned, we're experiencing a lead poisoning surge with California condors still today. That must mean I'm not doing my job. Well, I can throw out some other legislation for you. The law also dictates how you can buy ammunition. When you buy ammunition now, each purchase must be approved by the Department of Justice. Can you imagine that? Imagine something that you like to buy. I like to go on Amazon. I like to buy books. And I have trouble finding books a lot here in Salinas, California, where I live. And so I go online and purchase books, but I can't imagine having my purchase interrupted by a prompt saying, please wait, your order is being reviewed by the Department of Justice. And then it will say, hey, good news, your purchase has been approved. You can pick up your book in our Seattle office. Well, wait a minute. You can't ship it to me? No, I'm sorry. You have to pick it up, and the closest place you can do that is Seattle. Well, that's the rule with ammunition now. They've thrown in a face-to-face rule, meaning that you have to transfer ammunition face-to-face through a licensed vendor. So that rules out the internet. If you want to purchase ammunition now, you have to go to your local stores and you have to be happy with what you find on the shelves. We're finding that there isn't much on the shelves these days. And this really started with COVID. And yes, I like to blame everything on COVID. If I'm not able to see my family as much as I used to, I can blame it on COVID. If I want to stay home from work and work remotely, I can blame that on COVID. I'm going to try to blame the Condor declines on COVID. So bear with me here. When COVID hit back in early 2020, it caused a shelter-in-place order, and a lot of people were not able to buy ammunition at all. And then as the summer progressed, we saw a lot of social unrest. We saw some protests, riots, and we saw a huge spike in firearm purchases. And that increase in firearm purchases all was accompanied by purchases in ammunition. And it basically cleared the shelves. And the shelves have been cleared pretty much ever since. We're starting to see some ammunition return to the shelves, but those returns have been dominated by lead brands. The non-lead brands have been unavailable for many months now. So if you are a hunter or rancher and you want to follow the law, you're having a hard time right now finding non-lead ammunition. The law is there, but the mechanism to follow the law is broken. So that's where Ventana Wildlife Society comes in. We're an environmental organization, but we became a licensed ammunition vendor of all things. So we could provide free non-lead ammunition to hunters and ranchers. And we became a vendor because we needed to be able to legally conduct those DOJ background checks that are required. And so we are able now to purchase ammunition and distribute it to hunters and ranchers. And since we specialize in non-lead ammunition, we are able to maintain a pretty good stock of ammunition. We have a better stock of non-lead ammunition than any retailer that I know in the country. And that's because we're checking the market every day, buying whatever we can when we can. And as a vendor, we have the ability to have ammunition shipped directly to us to avoid the face-to-face requirement. So now we have the ammunition available to give to hunters and ranchers. And that's certainly good news. We can help the people reduce lead exposure for California Condors. The question becomes, with such a shortage of ammunition and the demand still so very high for non-lead ammunition, how do we decide who gets it? You ever have something that everybody wants and you have to decide who to give it to? It's not a comfortable decision. We have to decide who do we say yes to and who do we say no to. How would you think about that? Well, there are various ways that we can do it. I think in this day and age, we can just think about our cell phones. Aren't cell phones really the answer to all of life's problems? Can our cell phones save California condors? Well, we are going to let the condors tell us who gets the ammunition, and cell phones are going to play a part in that. So here's how. You see the numbers on this bird. This is a number 45. It also has a little bit of a antenna. These are radio telemetry transmitters. So biologists can go out with their antennas and they can track the birds. They can find out where they're going. It's a very exhaustive operation because you actually have to be within a certain range to get those signals. But with current technology, we can put GPS transmitters on these birds. And so at least half of the flock now has GPS. And so I can sit right here in my office and I can go online and determine where condors are at the moment. Why can I do this? How can I do this? Because of cell phone technology. That is, these are solar powered transmitters that are collecting locations up to once per minute. Condor flies near a cell phone tower. All that data gets transferred and uploaded to where I can access it on a server. And so I can determine where condors are flying. I can determine where condors are on the ground and likely feeding. And so if I can tell where condors are feeding, doesn't it seem possible that I can tell where they might be picking up lead? If I can figure out where they're picking up lead, then that's how I determine priority for non-lead ammunition outreach. Here's how it works. This is a map of properties. It happens to be San Diego County, but it really could be anywhere. The important part of this to illustrate the issue is that these different shades of blue indicate where condors are hanging out on the ground. Why are we interested in condors on the ground? That's a big reason for feeding. A big reason to go to the ground is feeding. So if they're on the ground, they're likely either feeding or drinking. And so we can really associate ground GPS locations with condor feeding activity. And these darker shades of blue indicate where that activity is raised. And so I can identify actual individual properties where I need to make contact with landowners and offer them free non-ammunition. This is a conceptual model of how this works. If we just look at all these properties, A through M, I guess it is, we might say that property J would be a high priority property because it's biggest and it's kind of the center of this neighborhood, so to speak. If I can get property J landowner interested in non-lead, maybe he or she will contact her neighbors and make them interested in non-lead as well. Word of mouth works great in the ranching community. And so property J might be my initial priority. But then I look at GPS and I find condors are frequenting several properties. And so J is actually a good target for non-lead outreach, as well as property L and maybe even property F and E out there. If I look at my contact database, I'll find that I already made contact with property F, G, L, D, and A. And all of those are on board with using non-lead ammunition. It's the other properties I haven't contacted yet. And so suddenly property E becomes of interest because I have not reached that property landowner yet. And so that becomes highest on my list. And I'd like to invite Kyra to share a question.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, you have to reach out to all these landowners to use non-lead ammunition. Is there any reason why they would choose to use that in the first place? Like, why is it just called ammo, like non-lead?
That's a good question. And the answer to that is absolutely critical. And it's going to be different for individual landowners. I think a big issue is performance. And anytime you're trying a new type of product, you might be more inclined to stick with what's been in the past. It works for all consumers. We tend to be loyal to what we've been using in the past. So when someone comes to invite them to try something different, there is a little bit of normal hesitancy. And so you have to give them a chance to try out those products. Non-lead, which is usually copper, is a little bit more expensive. So they're going to be paying a little bit more for non-lead ammo. So that's a disadvantage. Of course, we're getting ammunition to the free as part of this program, so that helps on that respect. But there is a little bit of that hesitancy about the performance. They have to be won over by the great performance of copper ammunition. And by and large, copper ammunition does perform well, but it shoots a little bit differently. It's a little bit lighter, and you have to zero in your target and practice a few shots to get used to that copper ammunition. So that is a process. And so it takes a little bit of time. And if you have someone approaching you telling you, well, you need to use this new product, the hunter might be a little bit reluctant, especially if that person telling them to change is one of those environmentalists that they view as responsible for instituting the ban on lead to begin with. So there's a little bit of that angst, a little bit of those hard feelings from the government telling them that they have to use non-lead ammunition. So all of those sort of emotions and factors are in play when we approach a landowner. But my approach really is to treat the landowner, treat the hunter as the solution, as someone who is leading the way towards condor recovery. They're the ones doing the right thing. They're the ones making a difference for wildlife. And if you pose it that way and allow the hunters to be the conservation-minded people that they generally are, then that message comes across very well. So it's a matter of continuing outreach until a lot of these bay areas that we identify as potential risk areas. We need to make contact with those landowners, get them on the non-lead train, and see them periodically, because the ammunition that we get them is not going to last forever. Some of these ranchers may shoot 1,000 breast squirrels a month. At least that's what they tell me. It sounds like a huge number. But when you're talking 1,000 rounds of ammunition a month, that extra cost of copper does add up, and the lack of availability becomes a problem for these landowners that are purchasing ammunition for themselves in the store. And so our program, even though it's sort of a temporary solution, we need to keep at it, keep these contacts, so that we ensure that there are fewer of these hot spots, fewer of these risk areas for condors. Andrea, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, based on your experience, how accepting has the community been of these new bullets? Ammunition.
Right, yeah. It mostly accepted. We did a survey of hunters and rangers, and we found that vast majority, 85 to 95% of them, really were quite satisfied with the quality of non-lead ammunition. They were satisfied with the performance. So that was certainly a good sign. There is a small percentage that really views the condor as the reason why they think the government is moving in on their freedoms. There is a belief that the non-lead ammunition requirement is just another government restriction designed to take away their guns. And so when I approach them, there's a lot of that residual hesitancy about getting involved in our program. And there is some thought among these individuals that, well, what I do on my private property is my business. And since I spent years of my life stockpiling lead ammunition, now the government is telling me I can't use it. Well, I'm going to use it up before I go out and buy non-lead ammunition. And so the opinions and the reactions, I think, are pretty much all across the board. Most everyone is supportive, but a few are not. And mine is easy. I get away stuff. And my job is really not to blow it. And so almost all hunters, just pretty close to 100% of the hunters I come in contact with are super polite with me. They want to see me because they're requesting ammunition. And so it really helps to have this program, not just to offset the cost. These folks can afford to buy ammunition, but to help them with the availability issue, help them with the legalese of going through those DOA background checks that they're not used to. And I think more important than even all of those things, just to send the message that environmental organizations are not necessarily against what they do. We support them. We want them to be satisfied with non-lead ammunition. So it sort of bridges that gap a little bit by running this program. We're essentially putting our money where our mouth is, and that is going over well with attitudes. Attitudes towards non-lead, toward condors are improving rapidly.
Yeah, I was just wondering if your program has ever thought about introducing or like telling ranchers to use rodenticides or pesticides against ground squirrels, or has it ever been thought to tell them what like integrated pest management to like completely like reduce hunting at all?
Yeah, that's a tricky topic, and it's hard to say what's better or worse sometimes. The use of rodenticides has been linked with poisoning in raptors. Certainly, rodenticide has its drawback. The solution is to not kill ground squirrels at all, but there's a pretty strong belief among ranchers that they are pests and that they do need to be controlled. And so our stance through this program has been to support their use of copper ammunition for controlling squirrels as an option. And so we've been very much in favor of them doing that because we know that condors really do follow their behaviors. Some of the ranchers tell us that the sound of a gunshot is almost like a dinner bell for condors. Condors will hear that gunshot and they'll come in linking that sound with the prospect of food offerings. And so the condors are eating those ground squirrel carcasses. And we think that that is a prominent source of lead. And so we really lean towards the control with copper ammunition. There's a new type of ammunition that's made of zinc that's also being used now. So yeah, I think there are different ways you can go about ground squirrel eradication. We've not been very vocal in evaluating those different methods, but we have been very supportive of ranchers using copper bullets.
Nancy had a question: if the pellets that you use in single pellet gun are common in urban areas, is this usually lead?
Generally, they have been, but non-lead ammunition is available for those as well. And certainly, if we're using that type of gun to shoot wildlife, that is required now in California.
I just wanted to check in the time. Do you have a hard stop at 11, or can you hang out with us a little longer? Because we're getting some really great questions. So you respect your time.
Yeah, I don't have any hard stop at all. I'm glad to stay and enjoy staying with you as long as the questions persist. So feel free to.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I think Andrea has a question. Yes.
Yeah, and those that leave at 11, feel free to drop out. I'm here to stay as long as folks are interested.
Yeah, and I'll continue recording this. So if any of you guys do have an obligation, this will be recorded and then they'll send you the YouTube link. So if there's good discussion after you guys leave, you can check back in and watch the rest of the presentation.
Oh, hello, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
As you're an environmentalist and now as an information provider, what is the other animal populations as a result of just keep shooting their species?
As far as lead poisoning goes,
No, as far as like populations of other species like ground squirrels and stuff like that.
I think it's all pretty anecdotal. When I speak with ranchers, they're always complaining that no matter how many ground squirrels they shoot, they all come back. That the populations rebound very quickly. That's not to say the populations would be higher if they didn't shoot, but certainly their ground squirrels are able to recover quite quickly from shooting, and certainly we have an interest in populations of other animals that are typically hunted because those often are food for condors, and so deer populations we're interested in, and we're interested in feral hog population, where right now there just seems to be a lot of pigs that are out there and doing damages to a lot of properties, and so there's a lot of interest in sort of controlling those populations. Hunters will tell you that the populations of deer are a little bit depressed now. A lot of hunters will tell you that they're not seeing as many deer as they're used to seeing, and they link that not so much with hunting, but with populations of mountain lions and bobcats, where those mountain lion populations seem to be possibly having an effect on the deer population. So yeah, not a lot of data, but just in terms of different population sizes, I think we're seeing different pressures at different times for these different populations. Kyra.
Sorry, could you just go over again the reasons why the condor became extinct in the first place?
Yeah, pretty much all through recent history, condors have been uncommon. And what I mean by recent history, I would say in 1900s, and I guess even going back to the late 1800s, condors were pretty much on a steady decline. Although there's not a lot of historical data that show that. It just seems to be population was gradually shrinking and declining. In the 1980s, it really wasn't clear what was going on with the condor population, and as a result, there was a lot of controversy as to what to do about the population. Biologists wanted to put radio transmitters on birds so they can learn more about what was killing them. And once they were authorized to do that, it became apparent that lead poisoning was a very prominent factor. That's for the first time biologists were able to follow birds and recover carcasses and do necropsies on these birds and find out what was actually killing them. So lead poisoning, in other cases, there were landowners that would indirectly poison condors. They would poison carcasses with the idea of preventing predators from claiming their livestock. And so we had things like strychnine poisoning that was really intended for things like coyotes or other predators, but the unintended consequence has been California condors. And so poisoning has really been the key instigator for the declines. And once they reached that critical level in the 1980s, it became apparent that birds would like extinct. And so those controversies pretty much dissipated in favor of bringing in all the birds, because it was fairly clear that with just 21 birds left in the wild, they were dying faster than they could reproduce. And so those poisonings, combined with their inability to crank out chicks very fast to recover, compared to turkey vultures, if a lot of turkey vultures die, they can at least replace their numbers fairly quickly because they produce more eggs, they produce more often, and they produce at a younger age. So they can replace themselves. Condors are not able to do that. And so all of those factors really combined to make them quickly endangered. That's the California condor. If you're interested, look at some of the other 22 species of which more than half of them are endangered. And so these are in other countries where poisoning of different types is causing critical endangerment of species, as well as shooting in biology, which is estimated populations of other species of vultures in the world. Martina, would you like to share your question?
Yes, so going back to the deer, just example, going to the conclusions of